Inside the private VIP room at Aurora, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars was minutes from closing. Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Infrastructure, sat across from two foreign investors, while her hired translator delivered every word with polished confidence. No one questioned him, but Ethan Brooks, the waiter refilling wine glasses in the corner, understood every syllable, and what he heard made his blood run cold. The translator wasn't making mistakes. He was rewriting the deal. One satisfying moment of truth was about to blow the room apart when Ethan whispered, "Your translator is lying." Ethan Brooks had worked at Aurora for nearly 2 years, long enough to memorize which wines went with which clients and which conversations were better left unheard. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Manhattan, the kind of place where a single dinner tab could exceed most people's monthly rent. He had learned early on that in a room full of powerful people, the safest thing a waiter could do was become furniture. Pour the wine, clear the plates, disappear. That was the job. That was survival. Before Aurora, Ethan had lived a different life. He had studied linguistics at Columbia, then pivoted into commercial law, not because he loved courtrooms, but because language fascinated him, and contracts were just another dialect. He had been good at it too, sharp enough to catch what others missed, careful enough to know when silence was more strategic than speech. But a series of personal losses had unraveled everything: his marriage, his ambitions, his belief that the world rewarded people who played by the rules. He walked away from all of it, not dramatically, quietly, the way a man leaves a burning building through the back door, hoping no one notices. Now he wore a black vest and carried a wine list, and most nights that was enough. He didn't talk about his past. His co-workers at Aurora knew him as the quiet one, reliable, precise, forgettable. His manager, a meticulous man named Gerald, valued Ethan for exactly those qualities. In a restaurant that served senators and hedge fund managers, discretion wasn't a bonus, it was a requirement. The paycheck wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady was everything when you were the only person keeping a household from falling apart. Tonight, however, the atmosphere inside Aurora's largest VIP room was different. Gerald had briefed the staff that morning with unusual seriousness. A private negotiation dinner had been booked 6 guests maximum. No interruptions unless signaled, and a specific wine list pre-approved by the client's office. The client was Victoria Hale. Even Ethan, who made a habit of not caring about the names behind the reservations, recognized that one. Victoria Hale was the founder and CEO of Hale Infrastructure, a company that had built bridges, tunnels, and transit systems across 3 continents. She had started with nothing, no family money, no inherited connections, and had turned a small engineering consultancy into a global empire through sheer force of competence and an almost legendary refusal to compromise on terms. Business magazines called her the Iron Claws because no contract left her desk without being airtight. Ethan entered the VIP room at exactly 7:45 minutes before the guests were scheduled to arrive. The space was enclosed by frosted glass walls and heavy curtains designed to make the outside world feel irrelevant. A long mahogany table sat at the center, set for 6, but feeling intimate enough for 2. He checked the glasses, adjusted the spacing of the silverware, and positioned the wine bottles at the serving station near the back wall, close enough to pour, far enough to stay out of the way. Victoria arrived first. She was tall, mid-40s, dressed in a dark navy suit that looked like it cost more than everything Ethan owned combined. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency, not vanity. She scanned the room, the way a general surveys terrain, quickly, completely missing nothing. She gave Ethan a brief nod when he offered water, and that was the extent of their interaction. He didn't expect more. People like Victoria Hale didn't see people like him. That was by design, both hers and his. Minutes later, 2 men arrived, the foreign investors' representatives of a European infrastructure consortium looking to partner with Hale Infrastructure on a massive expansion project. Ethan caught fragments of their conversation, as they entered enough to recognize the language enough to understand more than he should have. He kept his expression neutral and busied himself with the wine. The last to arrive was Daniel Mercer, the translator. He was younger than Ethan expected, mid-30s, clean-shaven with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of being the smartest person in rooms full of rich people. He shook hands with everyone, exchanged pleasantries in 2 languages without missing a beat, and settled into his chair between Victoria and the investors, like he had been born for exactly this seat. Ethan noticed that Daniel's suit was expensive, but not quite as expensive as he wanted people to think. A small detail, the kind of thing only someone trained to read people would catch. The dinner began smoothly. Ethan moved between the table and the serving station, pouring wine at appropriate intervals, clearing small plates, refilling water glasses. The conversation was formal, but not hostile. Both sides circling the terms of the deal, the way boxers circle each other in the early rounds. Victoria spoke in English, the investors responded in their language, and Daniel translated back and forth with fluid precision. To anyone watching casually, it was a perfectly choreographed negotiation. Ethan knew that Victoria actually spoke the investors' language. He had overheard her on the phone earlier that evening, confirming details with her legal team in fluent, rapid sentences that weren't English. But in negotiations at this level, using a translator was a strategic choice. It bought time to think between exchanges, and it let you observe how the other side behaved when they believed you couldn't understand them. It was a chess move, not a limitation, but Ethan wasn't watching casually. He couldn't help it. The words passing through Daniel's mouth were triggering something in the back of his mind, a muscle memory from years of studying contract language across multiple tongues. At first, Ethan told himself he was imagining things, a slight softening of a phrase here, a subtle shift in emphasis there. Translation was an art, not a science. Some flexibility was normal. He refilled Victoria's glass and took a step back toward the wall, trying to let it go. Then he heard it. One of the investors made a firm statement, a clear, unambiguous declaration that a specific liability clause was non-negotiable. The words were direct. There was no room for interpretation. But when Daniel turned to Victoria, what came out of his mouth was something else entirely. He told her the investors were open to a structured revision of the liability terms, and that they were willing to discuss flexible frameworks. Ethan's hand tightened around the neck of the wine bottle. That wasn't a translation error. That wasn't artistic license. That was a lie, deliberate, surgical, and designed to make Victoria believe she had leverage she didn't actually have. Ethan set the bottle down carefully and stepped into the service hallway behind the VIP room. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with shelves of extra glassware and folded linens. He pressed his back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. His heart was beating faster than it should have been. He knew what he had heard. He knew what it meant. If Victoria continued negotiating based on Daniel's version of the terms, she would be building her strategy on a foundation of lies. The liability exposure alone could cost her company tens of millions, maybe more, and she wouldn't know until it was too late. But this wasn't his world anymore. He had walked away from boardrooms and contracts and the language of power for a reason. He was a waiter. His job was to pour wine and stay quiet. If he spoke up, Gerald would fire him before the night was over. No restaurant in Manhattan would hire a waiter known for interfering with VIP clients. He would lose the one stable thing he had, the paycheck that kept everything together, the routine that held his life in place. Everything practical told him to stay in this hallway, finish his shift, and go home. But something else pulled at him, something older than practicality, older than fear. He thought about all the times he had stayed silent when silence was easier. He thought about the years he had spent disappearing into the background, telling himself it was a choice, when really it was just a slow surrender. He thought about what it meant to understand the truth and choose to let someone else be destroyed by a lie. Ethan straightened his vest. He picked up the wine bottle. He walked back into the VIP room. The conversation was still flowing. Daniel was mid-sentence, translating another round of terms with the same polished ease. Victoria was listening, her pen hovering above a notepad, her expression focused, but trusting. She had no reason to doubt the words reaching her. Ethan approached the table from Victoria's side. He leaned in to refill her glass, his movements slow and deliberate. As the wine poured, he lowered his voice to a level that only she could hear. The words came out steady, almost calm, as if he were reciting the evening's specials. "Ma'am, your translator is lying." Victoria's pen stopped moving. Her eyes didn't shift. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't look at Daniel. She simply held still the way a person holds still when they hear a sound in the dark and need a moment to decide if it's real. Then, without changing her expression, she lifted her glass and took a slow sip of wine. Ethan stepped back to his position near the wall. The room continued as if nothing had happened. But something had, and everyone in that room, whether they knew it yet or not, was about to feel the consequences. For the next several minutes, nothing in the VIP room appeared to change. Daniel continued translating with the same seamless rhythm. The investor spoke. Daniel converted their words into English, and Victoria listened with her usual composed intensity. But Ethan, standing near the back wall with the wine bottle at his side, could see something different. Now a shift so slight that no one else in the room would have caught it. Victoria's posture had changed, not dramatically. Her shoulders were the same. Her hand still rested near her notepad. Her expression remained engaged and professional. But her eyes had gone cold. She was no longer listening to understand. She was listening to verify. Ethan felt the weight of what he had done settle into his chest. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In Aurora's world, a waiter who whispered unsolicited information to a VIP client wasn't courageous. He was a liability. He imagined Gerald's face when the complaint came in the clipped tone of the termination conversation, the long walk to the service elevator, with his locker contents in a plastic bag. He had seen it happen to others for far less. A busboy once got fired for making eye contact with a client's wife for too long. This was Manhattan fine dining. The rules were simple and absolute: serve, don't speak. But what was done was done. Ethan refilled water glasses and watched the room from his position near the serving station. Victoria had asked one of the investors a follow-up question, a benign one about timeline expectations for the first phase of construction. Daniel translated it smoothly. The investor responded at length, and Daniel began converting the response into English. Ethan listened carefully. This time the translation was accurate. Close enough, at least. Daniel was being cautious now, perhaps sensing something in the air, or perhaps the earlier distortion had been targeted at specific clauses rather than applied broadly. Either way, the room moved forward, and Ethan began to wonder if Victoria had dismissed his warning entirely. A waiter who claims to understand international contract language, it sounded absurd even to him. Then Victoria made her move. She set her pen down flat on the table and looked directly at the lead investor, a tall, silver-haired man who had been doing most of the talking, and she spoke to him. Not in English, in his language. Her grammar was precise, and her vocabulary was specific enough to make everyone at the table freeze. She told him clearly and without hesitation that she wanted to revisit the liability clause discussed earlier. She wanted to hear his exact position again directly, without interpretation. The strategic mask she had worn all evening, the woman who needed a translator, was gone. This was Victoria Hale unfiltered. The investor blinked, visibly surprised, but recovered quickly. He repeated his original statement. The liability clause was non-negotiable. His consortium required full indemnification on structural failures during the first 5 years of operation. There was no flexibility. It was a hard condition, and it had always been a hard condition. Victoria nodded slowly. Then she turned to Daniel. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. Every surface seemed to reflect the tension back inward. The polished table, the frosted glass walls, the untouched dessert plates that Ethan hadn't yet cleared. Victoria's voice was calm when she spoke, but it carried an edge that made the air feel thin. She told Daniel she wanted him to translate what the investor had just said. Word for word. The same clause, the same terms. She wanted to hear how he would render it in English now in front of everyone. Daniel's confidence didn't crack immediately. He smiled the kind of practiced professional smile that people in his line of work deployed when they needed a moment to think. He began to speak, offering a version that split the difference between his earlier distortion and the truth. He said the investors had expressed a strong preference for indemnification, but remained open to discussing the scope and duration of liability terms within a collaborative framework. Victoria let him finish. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She simply waited until the last syllable left his mouth, and then she repeated in the investor's language what the lead investor had actually said. Full indemnification. Structural failures. 5 years. Non-negotiable. Then she switched back to English and addressed Daniel directly. She asked him to explain the difference between what the investor said and what he had just told her. She asked him to explain it in front of everyone at this table. The silence that followed was the kind that made people aware of their own breathing. The two investors exchanged a glance. The lead investor's expression shifted from surprise to something harder, a quiet reassessment of everything that had been said over the past hour. Daniel's smile faded. For the first time all evening, his composure showed a crack. Not a dramatic collapse, but a visible tightening around his jaw, a flicker behind his eyes that looked less like guilt and more like a man recalculating his options in real time. Daniel leaned forward slightly and addressed Victoria with measured calm. He explained that translation was not a mechanical process. He said that in high-stakes negotiations, a skilled interpreter didn't simply convert words, he conveyed intent, context, and cultural nuance. He suggested that what Victoria perceived as a discrepancy was actually a difference in interpretive approach. He called it flexible interpretation, a standard practice in cross-cultural deal-making. He said this with enough confidence that someone unfamiliar with the field might have believed him. Victoria didn't believe him. She had spent 20 years building a company on the principle that words meant exactly what they said, and she had just heard Daniel replace a hard no with a soft maybe. That wasn't cultural nuance. That was strategic manipulation. She looked at the investors and addressed them directly again in their language, apologizing for the confusion and assuring them that she had not been aware of the translation discrepancies until this moment. The lead investor responded with a brief formal statement. He said his consortium took accuracy seriously and that the integrity of communication was foundational to any partnership. His tone made it clear that the damage was already spreading. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to fractured. The second investor, who had been mostly quiet throughout the evening, leaned over and murmured something to his colleague. The lead investor nodded. He then addressed Victoria in careful English, speaking directly for the first time without relying on Daniel, and said that perhaps it would be best to pause the discussion and reconvene at a later date once both parties had time to review what had been communicated accurately and what had not. It was a diplomatic exit. It was also a death sentence for the evening's negotiation. Victoria understood exactly what was happening. A deal that had taken months to reach this stage, preliminary agreements, due diligence reviews, legal frameworks drafted and redrafted across time zones, was now unraveling in real time because the one person entrusted to carry words faithfully between two sides had chosen to rewrite them. She could feel the window closing. Every second of silence made it harder to reopen. She made her decision quickly, the way she made all decisions with clarity and without sentiment. She stood up from her chair and addressed the room. She told the investors that she was suspending the negotiation effective immediately. She said she would not ask them to continue a discussion that had been compromised by a breach of trust, and that her team would reach out within the week to propose a new framework for talks, one built on full transparency, with verified translation protocols and complete documentation. She thanked them for their time and their patience. The investors rose. Handshakes were exchanged, brief formal carrying, none of the warmth that had been present at the start of the evening. They collected their materials and left the VIP room without looking back. The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Victoria turned to Daniel. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply told him that his services were no longer required and that he should leave the restaurant. Daniel opened his mouth as if to offer one more defense, one more carefully worded justification, but something in Victoria's expression stopped him. For a brief moment, something crossed his face. Not remorse, but the recognition of a man who had played a hand and lost. He picked up his briefcase, adjusted his tie, a small, almost involuntary gesture of self-preservation, and walked out of the room. Ethan stepped aside to let him pass. Daniel didn't look at him. The VIP room was suddenly empty, except for Victoria and Ethan. She stood at the head of the table surrounded by half-finished wine glasses and unsigned documents, looking at the space where $100 million deal had been sitting 10 minutes ago. Then she picked up her phone and made a call, short, quiet, and in a tone that suggested she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Ethan began clearing the table. It was instinct when the world shifted. He reached for the familiar, stack the plates, collect the glasses, fold the napkins. He was halfway through when the door to the service corridor opened, and Gerald stepped in. His manager's face was tight, his lips pressed into a line that Ethan had seen directed at other employees right before they were escorted out. Gerald didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told Ethan to come with him to the back office. Now. Ethan set down the plates he was carrying. He followed Gerald through the service corridor, past the kitchen, past the staff lockers, into the small, windowless room that served as the manager's office. Gerald closed the door and stood behind his desk without sitting down. He told Ethan that a complaint had been flagged that Ethan had spoken directly to a VIP guest during a private negotiation dinner without authorization. He asked Ethan if this was true. Ethan didn't deny it. He said yes, he had spoken to the client. Gerald's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped half a register. He told Ethan that in 17 years of managing Aurora's floor staff, he had never once had a waiter insert himself into a client's private business. He said this was not a gray area. He said Ethan should wait here while he consulted with the restaurant's ownership about next steps. Gerald left the room. The door clicked shut. Ethan sat in a folding chair under fluorescent light, staring at a cork board pinned with staff schedules and health code reminders. He thought about the deal that had just collapsed in the other room. He thought about Victoria standing alone at that long mahogany table with nothing signed and nothing saved. He had told her the truth, and the truth had blown everything apart. The investors were gone. The translator was gone. The negotiation was dead, and now his job was almost certainly gone too. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a background character. He felt exposed, completely, irreversibly exposed. And he had no idea whether what he had done was brave or catastrophically stupid. All he knew was that the words had already been spoken, and there was no version of tonight where he could take them back. Ethan had been sitting in Gerald's office for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes when the door opened. He expected Gerald. He expected the termination speech, the formal language, the request to return his uniform, the reminder about the non-disclosure agreement every Aurora employee signed on their first day. Instead, it was Gerald, wearing an expression Ethan had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to bewilderment. Gerald told Ethan that the client in the VIP room had requested to speak with him, not complained about him, requested him. Gerald delivered this information the way a man might report that a cat had just solved a math equation technically possible, but deeply unsettling. Then he added almost to himself that in 17 years, he had never received a call like that from a client's legal office. He told Ethan to go to the VIP room immediately. Ethan walked back through the service corridor past the kitchen, where the closing crew was already scrubbing down surfaces, and pushed open the door to the VIP room. The space looked different now. The table had been partially cleared, his own half-finished work from earlier, but the wine glasses still sat where they had been abandoned, and the unsigned documents remained spread across the far end of the table like evidence at a crime scene. Victoria Hale stood near the window, her jacket draped over the back of a chair, her phone face down on the table beside her. She looked like someone who had just finished a war and was now surveying the cost. She turned when Ethan entered and studied him for a moment, with the same precise, evaluating gaze she had used when she first scanned the room hours ago. Then she asked him a question that had no business being directed at a waiter. She asked him why he understood contract terminology, not how. Why? The distinction mattered, and the fact that she chose that word told Ethan she already suspected the answer was more complicated than a hobby or a lucky guess. Ethan considered deflecting. He could have said he picked things up from overhearing clients. He could have played dumb, thanked her for not getting him fired, and retreated back into the safe anonymity of his black vest and wine list. But something about the way Victoria asked the question direct, without judgment, without condescension, made deflection feel like another form of lying. And he had spent the entire evening risking everything because he believed lying was wrong. It would be a strange time to start. So he told her. Not the full autobiography, she didn't need that, and he wasn't offering it. But enough. Colombia. Commercial law. Years spent reviewing cross-border agreements and analyzing the kind of language that Daniel Mercer had distorted tonight. He told her he had been good at it, good enough to know the difference between a non-negotiable clause and a flexible framework. And he told her he had walked away after his life fell apart, and that he had ended up at Aurora because it was the only place where staying quiet felt like a reasonable way to keep going. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't offer sympathy or press for details. She simply nodded the way someone acknowledges a fact that confirms a theory they had already been building. Then she sat down at the table and told him what she had found in the last 30 minutes. After the investors left and Daniel was escorted out, Victoria had pulled the audio recording of the entire dinner. She recorded all her negotiation meetings, a practice her legal team had insisted on years ago, and one that had saved her more than once. She had spent the time while Ethan sat in Gerald's office reviewing the recording, with one of her senior attorneys over the phone comparing Daniel's translations against the investors' actual statements. The results were worse than what Ethan had caught. The liability clause wasn't the only thing Daniel had altered. He had softened exclusivity terms, reframed penalty structures, and introduced language around profit sharing that the investors had never proposed. Every change pointed in the same direction, toward conditions that would have benefited not Victoria, not the investors, but a third party. Someone outside the room. Someone who had hired Daniel not to translate, but to engineer an agreement that would quietly redirect leverage away from Hale infrastructure. Victoria told Ethan she didn't yet know who the third party was, but her legal team was already working on it. What she did know was that if Ethan hadn't spoken up, she would have continued the negotiation based on false information. She might not have signed the deal tonight. Victoria Hale never signed anything without a full review. But the distorted terms would have shaped her strategy, her counteroffers, her entire approach to the partnership. The damage would have been structural, embedded in every decision that followed. By the time she discovered the truth, it might have been too late to undo. She looked at Ethan across the table, the same table where 2 hours earlier he had been a silent figure pouring wine in the background. She told him the deal was dead, at least in its current form. She was going to rebuild the negotiation from scratch, with verified translation, full documentation, and new protocols for every communication channel. It would take time, it would cost money, but it would be clean, and that mattered more to her than speed. Then she made him an offer. She said she needed someone to sit with her legal team that night, not permanently, not as an employee of Hale Infrastructure, but as a temporary consulting pair of eyes to review every clause in the draft agreement and flag anything that didn't match the recorded conversation. She needed someone who understood both the language the investors spoke and the architecture of international contracts. She needed someone who had already proven under pressure that he would choose accuracy over self-preservation. She asked Ethan if he was willing. Ethan stood near the door of the VIP room, still wearing his Aurora uniform, still technically on the clock for a job he might not have tomorrow. The offer didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a door, one that opened back into the world he had left behind, the world of language and law and high-stakes decisions that could build or destroy entire companies. He had spent 2 years convincing himself he didn't belong in that world anymore, that it was safer on the outside, that fading into the background was a form of peace, but tonight had already shattered that illusion. The moment he leaned in and whispered to Victoria, he had stopped being the man who hid, and standing here now being asked to use the skills he had buried for years, he realized that walking away from who he was hadn't been peace at all. It had been surrender dressed up as a strategy. The skills were still there. The instincts were still sharp. The only thing that had changed was his willingness to use them. He told Victoria he would do it. She nodded, not with warmth exactly, but with the kind of respect that Victoria Hale reserved for people who had earned it through action rather than credentials. She picked up her phone and called her attorney back, telling him she had someone joining the review. Then she gestured to the chair across from her and told Ethan to sit down. For the next 3 hours they worked. Victoria pulled up the draft agreement on her laptop, while Ethan listened to sections of the audio recording and cross-referenced them against the written terms. He flagged 7 additional discrepancies that Daniel had woven into the translation, subtle enough to pass a casual review, significant enough to shift millions of dollars in liability and profit allocation. Victoria marked each one, made notes for her legal team, and began restructuring her approach to the renegotiation. They didn't talk about anything personal. They didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. It was past midnight when they finished. The restaurant had long since closed. Gerald had gone home after receiving a phone call from Victoria's office, confirming that Ethan was assisting the client at her direct request, a message that Gerald clearly didn't understand, but knew better than to challenge. The VIP room, which had started the evening as a stage for a $100 million negotiation, had become something quieter, a workspace, a table with 2 people doing careful, honest work under low light. Victoria closed her laptop and looked at Ethan, not the way she had looked at him when he was pouring wine, and not the way she had looked at him when she was questioning his background. She looked at him the way one professional looks at another when the job is done and done well. Then she said something that Ethan would carry with him long after he left that room, long after this night became a memory. "Integrity is rarer than talent," Victoria said. "I've met hundreds of talented people. Lawyers, translators, engineers, executives, talented people are everywhere. But someone who sees the truth, knows the cost of speaking it, and speaks it anyway, that's rare. That's what I can't hire off a resume." Ethan didn't respond with anything clever. He simply nodded. It was enough. He left the VIP room and walked through the empty restaurant, past the darkened bar, past the polished hostess stand, past the front windows that looked out over a city that never stopped making deals. He stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the cold night air against his face. The city hummed around him, indifferent and vast, the same way it had hummed every other night he had walked home after a shift. But tonight, he wasn't the same person who had clocked in. He wasn't the man who disappeared into the background anymore. He wasn't the ghost of a career he had abandoned. He was someone who had told the truth when it cost him everything, and discovered that the truth was the only thing he had never actually lost. The story didn't end with a signed contract. No deal was closed that night. No partnership was formalized. What ended that evening in the same room where it all began was simpler and harder to put on paper. A man who had been hiding remembered who he was. A woman who trusted no one found a reason to trust again. And a lie that was meant to stay hidden was dragged into the light by the one person in the room that no one thought was paying attention.